Hey all, so today we're going to be looking at transfers of energy and matter. We're looking at page 529 to 553. There's a lot of pages to cover in this video, so it might be a bit long. I apologize. We're looking at interactions and interdependence, and we want to try to answer these two questions. What's the reason that matter can be recycled in ecosystems, but energy cannot? And how is the energy that is lost by each group of organisms in an ecosystem replaced? So when we are talking about ecosystems and energy, the concept of ecosystems is that all organisms in an environment that work together with their abiotic environment. So that is what an ecosystem is. And then we have open systems where matter and energy can both enter and exit. And then we have closed systems where energy can enter or exit, but matter cannot. And so an open system is an ecosystem. A closed system would be something like the Earth because there's not much matter coming in or going out from Earth. But there is all the sunlight. So producers are going to rely, those are plants, are going to rely on sunlight for their energy through photosynthesis. They are at the bottom of the food chain, and light varies on the earth. And as you go deeper into water, so that's going to affect their ability to photosynthesize. Organisms that live at the equator get more direct sunlight and have a warmer climate, so they're able to just grow all year round. And as a result, their biomass grows faster than at other places on the planet. Archaea can live in sealed up caves, so they don't have access to sunlight or matter. And instead, they're using inorganic chemicals for energy. So this is called chemosynthesis. They're using sulfur or methane. And actually, they make this like film, kind of like a, I don't know, slimy layer. And in the caves are invertebrates also. So those would be like kind of bugs or things without a backbone. And they eat the archaea film in order to survive in the caves. And so this here would be the archaea and the bacterial crystals that form. And then they create a film layer on the rocks and on the liquids in the cave. All right, so when we're thinking about autotrophs, these are producers. They are going to be creating amino acids, fats, sugars, hormones using sunlight or chemicals, plus CO2 or hydrogen carbonate. And then additional nutrients are going to be needed in order to make these things. And those are going to happen in exothermic reactions. So what's going on there? And if you are HL, you're going to have to know this reaction in much more detail when we look at the exact detail of photosynthesis. But what's happening here is that sunlight or chemicals is allowing hydrogen ions to be pulled off of molecules. And this is an oxidation reaction. And then those hydrogen ions, you can see them here, are going to move through ATP synthase inside a mitochondrial membrane. And that's going to produce ATP. And then that will be used for energy within the cell. So if you're SL, that's the some extent of what you need to know. In HL, we'll talk about it a bit more. So this is an example of iron oxidizing bacteria. So they're using iron here, and they're pulling off the electrons to use. And what's going on there? Those electrons move through these systems. And in doing so, these electrons are added to water, hydrogen ion, sorry, yeah, they're added to oxygen to produce water. Hydrogen ions are pumped through the system into this intermembrane space, and that is going to end up producing ATP through ATP synthase. And those hydrogen ions are going to be used to link back up with with oxygen when the electrons are present to make water. So this is the chemical reaction of what's going on if you were using iron sulfide and water, oxygen and water. It's making iron and sulfate and sulfuric acid. And then Fe2 is going to be able to be utilized to make a hydrogen ion here. and it's going to reduce this NAD. These NADs go to the, so you can see them right here. They're the original hydrogen ion donor, and the NAD itself is a hydrogen ion carrier. But this is getting a bit more into HL content. So for SL students, don't worry about this too much. And then, yeah, the hydrogen ions are going to move through the ATP synthase. So heterotrophs are able to eat or engulf food. We saw this in the last video, and we called them holozoic nutrition. And so this can be plants or animals, and they're getting carbon and energy and assimilating their molecules into their bodies. They're going to need lots of other nutrients as well. So, for example, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, perhaps. So decomposers are an example of a heterotroph. So this could be earthworms or vultures here, and they're going to use dead organic matter for food. Saprotrophs, we've already talked about. They are going to digest externally and then suck up the digested juice of dead stuff through their rhizomes and help recycle these chemical elements. And trophic levels are what we're going to see in food webs. They're classifications as to how the organisms are getting energy. So many organisms occupy multiple trophic levels. And so if you were at a plant level, you're the base of the food chain. And so you're at trophic level 1, you're a producer. And if you were a primary consumer, you would be at trophic level 2, which means you are eating plants. So ATP is needed by each organism for making these macromolecules, like proteins, for example, in their bodies, for transporting materials, for moving, and for maintaining their body temperature. So this is why it's important, like we saw on the last slide, for organisms to be having this hydrogen ion source that can make then ATP synthase in mitochondria. So here you can see trophic levels. So we have our producers at the bottom, then the rabbit, that's the first trophic level, the snake's the second, and then the eagle or whatever that is the third. First, second, third, fourth. And you'll notice that producers have their own name. These are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So organisms feed on each other. That's not any new news for anyone. The base of the food chain are the producers. And usually we're limited to 4 or 5 eaters. So usually 5 trophic levels, because energy transfer from one level to the next is not 100%. Typically, the last consumer, like this eagle, is not being eaten because they are apex predators. This, in most cases, are humans, for example. But food webs are complex because not all consumers eat just one thing, just like humans. Organisms on the same trophic levels tend to be shown at the same level. So if you had like a web, you would have all of the producers at the bottom, and then in a line above, you would have all of the primary consumers. And energy is lost between, you can see this happening. So there's 10,000 kilocalories of producers. That just means there's lots of plants. And so the rabbit eats the plants and it digests a bunch of the plants. But what's happening is the rabbit can't digest everything. It's not eating all of the plant. And it poops out some stuff, right? And then also it needs to maintain its body system. So it's releasing heat through that process. And so not 100% of the plant energy goes to the rabbit. And so as a result, actually only about 10% of the energy gets transmitted into the biomass of that rabbit. And so if the snakes are eating rabbits, there's just less rabbits. And even though they can get lots of energy from the meat of the rabbit, there's not as many rabbits. So when we are looking at food chains or food webs, we're typically limited to 4 eaters, 5 levels, because these tertiary consumers just can't find enough food of their other food sources. And then they also lose energy along the way. And these are the reasons that food chains are limited in length. So energy enters ecosystems as sunlight, which is then transferred to chemical energy via photosynthesis. All the energy is converted into some heat to maintain temperatures It's also a side effect of activity and the use of ATP, heat generation. And that heat is lost to the environment and it can't be recycled. Once the heat is out of your body, it's not coming back to your body, not going back in it at least. Trophic levels are limited because the amount of energy at higher levels is just less. So there's less biomass there. However, many apex predators don't just rely on the organisms right below them in the trophic level. They might be eating across trophic levels. And they would have to in order to be able to get enough food. Primary production is biomass created by plants through photosynthesis, and this can be measured over long periods of time. So if we're talking about GPP, this stands for gross primary productivity. This is the total biomass being produced by plants through photosynthesis. And then NPP, net primary productivity, is going to be the GPP, the total biomass produced, minus the biomass lost due to respiration. And so we are going to be measuring biomass that's available for consumers as NPP. And that's going to be grams of carbon or tons of carbon or kilograms of carbon per meter squared. So in an area, an amount of carbon in an area over a time frame. So meters squared per year, for example. And when we are looking at carbon cycles, we are going to be having primary productivity, which is plants taking biomass into their bodies using photosynthesis. And then secondary production is the accumulation of carbon compounds by heterotrophs. So for example, using glucose, how much energy is produced, and the NSP, so how much you eat is going to be your gross primary productivity. And then net primary productivity is how much is actually staying of that energy is staying in the body. And that's going to reduce at each trophic level, as we have been talking about. So there are some words that we need to be comfortable with here. Number one is pool. So that's a reserve of carbon. So for example, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a pool of carbon. And then flux, which is the transfer of carbon from one pool to another. So that would be feeding or respiration or photosynthesis. So if photosynthesis is greater than respiration, then you have a net uptake of carbon, and that's going to act as a carbon sink. But if you have more respiration than photosynthesis, you're going to have a net release of carbon, and that's going to be a source of carbon. And so here you can see an energy pyramid with the amount of calories decreasing as you increase up the pyramid. And these are founded on the laws of thermodynamics. So the first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. And then the second law of thermodynamics is saying that energy is going to move from an area of high energy to an area of low energy. So warm things become cool because they release energy from the warm place to the cool place. All right, so when we're thinking about sources of carbon dioxide, combustion is a pretty significant one, especially as it relates to climate change. So we have oil and natural gas. Those were created about 550 million years ago from organic matter that decomposed under sediment. We have coal that was formed about 200 to 300 million years ago from plants in swamps. And then peat, which is not very old, about 100,000 years old. And this is incomplete decomposition of plants. There's still a lot of carbon dioxide stored in peat. And the challenge for this is that as it dries out, it releases all of that carbon dioxide that's stored there back into the atmosphere. Finland used to use peat a lot, especially in the north, for energy generation. But they've moved away from it because it's far worse for carbon dioxide emissions than even using coal. And then there's biomass, which is thousands of years. This is just wood or other organic material that you're burning. Combustion only happens at certain temperatures. So you have something called a flash point. It's plus or minus 500 degrees Celsius for fossil fuels. And these fossil fuels, when they burn, are going to release carbon dioxide. So all the carbon sinks, all of the carbon is in a sink when it's coal or peat, and it's sequestered for indefinite time. So, meaning it's being held for indefinite periods of time because that's dead organic matter that contained carbon and it's being held in that place. But if we burn it, that carbon dioxide is now being released. And so wildfires produce, for example, carbon dioxide. In the Permian extinction event, uh, which was about 300 million years ago, sorry, coal was burned by volcanoes underground, and it dramatically increased the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And that triggered very, very high temperatures due to climate change, and then killed off like 75% of the life on the planet. So when we're thinking about climate change, we need to consider something called the Keeling curve. This is due to the guy named Keeling who did this research. Since the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide has been increasing in our atmosphere, and this has been measured in Hawaii since 1959 at Mauna Loa at the top of this hill in Hawaii. So it's pretty far away from everything else. And you can see that this curve is increasing. And so 280 is what pre-industrial levels were. We're now up close to 420. We can see annual fluctuations, and that's caused by seasonal variation. So you're going to end up having reduction of carbon dioxide in the summer months as plants are growing in the Northern Hemisphere, because most of the land is in the Northern Hemisphere. And then that will, carbon dioxide will increase in the winter months. But the long-term trend is that carbon dioxide is rising. Oxygen only comes from photosynthesis, which evolved about billions of years ago in archaea bacteria, and the flux between carbon dioxide and oxygen is roughly equal, so about 120 gigatons per year of carbon, meaning that photosynthesis and respiration right now are naturally pretty balanced or pretty stable, but then humans are adding, through combustion processes, more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So to summarize, carbon is cycled through the environment by autotrophs, which are producers, those are plants, and heterotrophs, consumers, which are eaters. And decomposers are going to recycle carbon and other nutrients from dead stuff. So like worm poop. Worms eat dead stuff, they break down a bunch of stuff, and then they poop out a bunch of leftovers, which can be useful for nutrients. And then also birds can eat worms, for example. Autotrophs produce oxygen as a waste product. Food chains are limited by how much energy is available as biomass to the next trophic level. Energy is lost from level to level, which just means that there are less of those different organisms at each trophic level as you go up. And then combustion of fossil fuels increases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this is shown in the Keeling curve. Thank you very much for watching this one, and that is all for today.